When I was growing up, I used to worship comic book superheroes. And I'd spend my time running around my parents' house dressed as Superman, saving the world from all manner of catastrophe. And then I grew up and I entered into the world of finance and developed a career there, ending up, as I am today, as the chief financial officer of a company. Now, as you can tell, I'm much more of a Clark Kent character than I am his superhero alter ego. And my wife is very particular about not allowing me to run around the house dressed as Superman. But whilst my life has changed a lot from when I was a kid, there's one thing that I still dream about, and that is saving the world from climate change. Now, that might be sound a bit odd, coming as it does from a chief financial officer, because let's be honest, the stereotypes around chief financial officers aren't great. If we were coming up with a comic strip today about chief financial officers, the CFO would be the society's anti-hero, the gray-suited, money-focused bean counter. And I can tell you that that stereotype does not get you invitations to cool people's dinner parties. Whilst that stereotype is there for a reason, and I believe that it is chief financial officers that have a key role to play in solving climate change and sustainable development. Now, when we typically think about a chief financial officer, what do we think about? Well, we think about the idea that a company should focus on maximizing profits and shareholder returns. And that is the Milton Friedman view of the world. But increasingly, chief executives and shareholder groups are beginning to understand that companies with a purpose are far more likely to deliver excess shareholder returns than companies who are focused just on making money. And the Milton Friedman view of the world has been shown to be a fallacy, and there's plenty of research to back this up. For example, a study by Harvard University shows that companies with high degree of purpose outperform by typically around 6% per year. They deliver higher profitability, and they achieve valuations 20% higher than their peer group who do not have high degrees of purpose. So, what's the role of the CFO in all of this, and why is the role of the CFO so important? Well, the key is capital allocation decisions. And this is principally what chief financial officers are focused on. When a company does business, it uses 4 forms of capital. It exploits financial capital in the form of money that comes from shareholders and that comes from lenders like banks. Companies exploit natural capital, which is the goods and services that we get from nature. Human capital, in the form of the input from employees in terms of labor, and also, of course, ingenuity and imagination. And then social capital, in the form of the relationship that exists between a company and the society in which it operates. And that relationship can be both positive and negative, of course. And when we look at the profit and loss of a company, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing the impact of the exploitation of those resources. And how companies treat that exploitation determines whether we go down a path of sustainable development or whether we continue to career as we are out of control towards a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 degree world. Now, the key component here is resource allocation. And as we've just seen, for a company to generate profits, it needs to exploit resources. At the same time, that resource exploitation is what drives sustainable development, or the lack of it. And for a chief financial officer who has a sustainability mindset, you have a very different outcome from a chief financial officer who has a Milton Friedman view of the world. And that's the crux of this talk. If we believe that chief financial officers control the capital allocation decisions within companies, which they do, And if we know that sustainable development depends on how we treat and how we use resources, which it does, then if we're genuinely serious about climate change, if we are genuinely serious about sustainable development, then we need to start framing the thinking and the behavior of CFOs as people who are responsible not just for financial capital, but for the management of natural capital, of human capital, and of social capital. We need to start to put the burden of responsibility for sustainability and for sustainable development squarely on the shoulders of chief financial officers. We need to make CFOs both chief financial officer and chief sustainability officer. And when that happens, we change the mandate of the CFO and we change the mindset of the CFO. And when we change the mindsets of the CFO, then we move from focus on consumption to a focus on resource use efficiency. From waste, a view that waste is a byproduct, to waste as an asset. From the tragedy of the commons, which is what drives climate change, to effective pricing in of externalities. And when we change mindsets like this, then we will change the way companies operate, because companies will start to focus on sustainability to drive their bottom line. We will start to see innovation around sustainability. We will at last start to move in the direction of sustainable development. And there's one final thing that we need to deal with, which is the title of the CFO. Because as long as it's Chief Financial Officer, then the focus surely must be on the bottom line. If we ensure that within the title of the Chief Financial Officer, the focus is on sustainable development, then what we will see is an extension of that mindset shift. We will see a psychological change to focus on sustainable development, not just the bottom line. We will see massive financial flows being driven up and down supply chains in every industry in the world. And when that happens, chief financial officers will genuinely start to contribute to sustainable development. Chief financial officers will genuinely start to change the world when it comes to climate change. And for me, as one of those CFOs, it will mean that I will at last be able to fulfill that childhood fantasy and become a real-world superhero. Thank you.